Welcome to OECD Podcast, where policy meets people.
From clean energy to economic reconciliation, First Nations communities are taking the lead on projects that are shaping the future. One organisation at the heart of this transformation is the First Nations Major Projects Coalition, or FNMPC, which is a First Nations-led group in Canada helping Indigenous communities secure ownership in major energy and infrastructure developments across the country. Today, we're speaking with Mark Podlasly, CEO of this coalition and a member of the Nlaka'pamux Nation in British Columbia, Canada. Sinead Teevan from the OECD, who is Indigenous from Curve Lake First Nation in Ontario, will talk with Mark about how Indigenous leadership is reshaping investment, policy, and clean energy. In fact, Sinead joined the OECD from the Ministry of Ontario, where she was working in Indigenous energy policy, and she's going to dig into why including First Nations and Indigenous communities in national and rural policy making isn't just the right thing to do, but it's essential in order to get the big things done.
Mark, let's start with the basics for those who may not know. What is the First Nations Major Project Coalition, and what kind of work do you guys do?
The First Nations Major Projects Coalition is a non-profit, Indigenous-led organization of 175 nations or communities across Canada in every time zone. And the coalition was founded to assist nations negotiate better environmental and economic outcomes for major projects proposed in our territories. In many cases, that means equity positions in major projects.
Wow, okay. So this is a powerful mission, both protecting traditional lands and helping First Nations become economic partners in projects on their own territory. You've been with the FNMPC since its early days as a co-founder. How has the coalition grown or evolved over the past few years?
The coalition started approximately 10 years ago and was founded by 11 First Nations communities in northern British Columbia when they had negotiated an equity position in a natural gas pipeline. They had an opportunity to invest up to 30% to gain an equity stake in the project, but could not raise the funds at an affordable rate, so they lost the opportunity. They thought this is going to happen again, and we need our own organization to get us ready for when it would happen again. And it's happened over and over and over across Canada, so much so that those 11 nations are now 175.
Wow. So this is clearly not just a policy voice, but an organization that is also deeply involved in the real-world projects facing First Nations communities in Canada. Could you give us a sense of some of the sectors or types of innovation that this coalition is supporting?
The coalition responds to questions that come from the communities and from the nations. So we're involved in clean energy projects like electric transmission, electric generation, additional pipelines in terms of natural gas for liquid natural gas facilities. And increasingly, we're being asked to participate in projects around infrastructure like railway corridors and other port facilities.
Wow. So prevalent now more than ever, I'm sure, with this new trade stuff. So the role in rural and combating climate change in clean energy seems to be a reoccurring theme, not just in Canada, but globally. Why is First Nations or Indigenous leadership so central to combating climate change and boosting clean energy?
In Canada, almost all the clean energy sources are coming from our territories. Clean energy and critical minerals are not found in the cities, they're found in our territories and remote parts of the country. So we have a vital role to play in ensuring that Canada can meet its obligations to net zero, and increasingly, through export markets, other countries can as well. If First Nations are not involved in these projects, they will be delayed through court action or legal challenges, or increasingly, increasing costs of capital for non-Indigenous companies. So we have a very vital role to play.
Right, and this includes navigating the green transition at large with inclusion.
Yes, yes.
So this is interesting that you mention all these values, because something that really stands out in the FNMPC's work is the emphasis on Indigenous First Nations values and consent. Why is Indigenous or First Nation consent such a game changer for project development in Canada?
In Canada, Canada signed the UN Declaration for Indigenous People, or Rights for Indigenous People. In there is the concept of free, prior, informed consent. That is the law in Canada. So in order to gain the consent for these projects, Indigenous people increasingly are standing up saying we want a say in not only how the projects are built and operated, we want to benefit from the projects which are in our territories and in many cases leave impacts that urban Canadians will not face.
Right, of course. Thank you. So let's turn to policy now. You've said that Indigenous and First Nations voices need to be more central in both rural and national policymaking. Why is this so important?
A lot of the things in Canada that affect us as Indigenous people have come from a colonial legacy from the 1800s. Legal structures were put in place that were assimilationist. They were trying to remove us not only from the land, but from the national psyche. What's happening now, though, is those policies from the 1800s affect our ability now to raise capital in public markets. They affect our ability to invest in projects like the ones I've just described. So it's vital that we have a say now in shaping where we're going forward, because we want to be included in the society as equal partners.
Right, of course. And practically speaking, how can governments include Indigenous or First Nations communities in decision-making processes?
In Canada, there's a large push now for Indigenous people to have a say in the decision-making processes. If it goes to permitting, for example, or environmental approvals, you're starting to see communities and nations in Canada actually run the environmental processes for liquid natural gas pipeline rights of way, increasingly mining projects. So that's one way. The other way is on the economic side. Because we've been barred from the economic system of the country for so long, it's important now that the government fix that, but does it in such a way that respects the values of the Indigenous people in the policies.
Right, okay. Could you give us a few examples of the impact you've seen with this project or the coalition on these communities?
I'll give you one from my community. We are located approximately 400 kilometers east of Vancouver on the west coast on the Pacific. In our territory, we have Canada's largest open pit copper mine. It's been operating for 40 years. And in that 40 years, we have had no benefits from it. There had not been jobs or procurement. We were an afterthought. And in some cases, in the bottom of the pit, the community that used to be there was one of our main villages. The change now, though, as we're involved, is that we have a revenue sharing deal on the project. We also share in the mineral tax collected. There's now agreements in place where our members can have employment in there and training, which we did not have before. The benefits to our community is that we make decisions now on how that revenue will be invested in our communities. And that means improved healthcare for elders, better infrastructure that we can pay for, education opportunities to our youth, and language revitalization, which is a very important thing for Indigenous people in Canada.
Right, well, language is culture. And this is far too common of a story with no benefit sharing with these major projects. You've also spoken at global conferences and events. From your perspective, how is the international conversation around Indigenous and First Nations community inclusion changing?
What we found at the coalition is that we have international Indigenous groups coming to us regularly, wanting to learn what we're doing, what are we trying to accomplish. We are accomplishing success in the areas of having Indigenous people involved in the projects, and so groups from Australia, New Zealand, and the United States, and increasingly now Latin America and South America, are approaching us, asking us how did we do it and how does it work, and also wanting to know how is the company and government responding.
Right, yeah, it's incredibly interesting. Before we wrap up, I do want to ask you to zoom out a bit and focus on what does success look like to you, not just for FNMPC, but for Indigenous or First Nations community economic participation more broadly over the next 10 years?
The past 10 years, we've had incredible success raising the awareness of how important it is for Indigenous people to be integrated into the Canadian economy and accessing funds to invest in our mutual shared prosperity. 10 years going forward, what we'd like to see is Indigenous pools of capital come to the point where we can start to invest our own capital into projects, not just in our own territories, but anywhere in the world. Having an Indigenous population integrated into the economy as equals is good for the entire economy. It's not just Indigenous people. That's
Right.
where I want to see us go in the next 10 years.
Right. Well, it's a hopeful and urgent vision for sure. That is all, Mark. Thank you so much for joining us today and for sharing your insights. It's been a real pleasure to have you here.
Thank you. I've been honored to be here.
To listeners of OECD Podcast, be sure to follow along as we continue this series. We'll be highlighting transformative leaders, big ideas, and better policies from cities to rural regions and pretty much everywhere in between. If you want to learn more about OECD work on how Indigenous communities are involved in major energy and infrastructure developments, visit oecd.org, and you can search under regional development and rural development. And well, that's all from us today with Mark and Sinead, who we extend a huge thanks to for their time. I'm Shane McLaughlin at the OECD Centre for Entrepreneurship, SME, Cities and Regions. We'll see you next time on OECD Podcasts.
To listen to other OECD podcasts, find us on iTunes, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and SoundCloud.com/OECD.